Great. Well, hello, everybody. Welcome. It's great to see so many faces out there on this, this summer day. I wanted to welcome you all to New America. My name is Lisa Guernsey. I'm the Deputy Director for our Education Policy Program here. And I'm also the Director of the Learning Technologies Project, which is a relatively new program within our Ed Policy team. We work alongside the Open Technology Institute and several projects. And this event is something that we're doing together with the Open Technology Institute, and want to thank them, as well as BSA, the Software Alliance, for to put this together. So we are going to jump right in. Oh, I should first, just for those of you who might be new to New America, just quickly give you a kind of a sense of where you are and what we do here at New America. We are a public policy institute or think tank. We're also a civic enterprise. And our tagline, which deserves probably a lot more conversation, and maybe later in our conversation we can get to it, but our tagline is that we are dedicated to politics, prosperity, and purpose in the digital age. Technology is a big part of what we do in terms of our thinking about how to be forward-looking in terms of policy here at New America and for society at large. So this is a great confluence of events for us, and we really appreciate the opportunity to have a discussion about some of the issues we're going to be talking about today. I'm going to take a moment to just quickly introduce this really fantastic group of panelists who are before us, and then we're going to launch right into a conversation where I'll be asking Victoria first, and I'll introduce in a moment, to give us some remarks that will set the stage for our discussion, and then we'll go down the line and have a deeper conversation. I also do want you all to think about questions that you could raise. We want to make sure we're engaging our audience and all of you. So certainly before the end, which will probably be a little shorter, perhaps around 4:10 is when we'll be closing down. But before that, I want to make sure that we have some time to ask you questions. So the folks who we have with us today are, to my left, is Victoria Espinel. She is the president and CEO of BSA, the Software Alliance. To her left is Mark Domes, who is the former Undersecretary for Economic Affairs at the Department of Commerce. We have with us as well Ryan Burke, who is Senior Policy Advisor on the National Economic Council for the White House. Cameron Wilson, who is our the Chief Operating Officer and Vice President for, of Government Relations for Code.org. And Melissa Moritz, who is Deputy Director of STEM. And for those of you who may not know, I'm sure everyone in this room does, but that's Science, Technology, Engineering, and Math, Deputy Director of STEM for the Department of Education. So already, I hope you can see this is a pretty amazing group of people to be talking about these issues. We can really kind of go cross-disciplinarily into what we'll be discussing today, which really is about the economic impact of software and what this means for the 21st century in terms of policy and our economic growth as a country. So I'm going to start, of course, with you, Victoria, to help us understand some of the findings in this latest report that your group has put out. Can you give us a sense of some of the top-level findings, and to also tell us what was most surprising to you about this report?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And first, thanks to Lisa and to New America for putting this event together. So I think we all know that software is changing our lives in ways that are big and small every day. It's changing the way people communicate with their families. It's letting farmers and doctors and scientists push past the boundaries of human limitations that have existed. It is having an enormous beneficial impact on our society. But we were really interested to learn what the impact on the economy was, the US economy was. And for that reason, we worked with the Economist Intelligence Unit, and I think Anil Sard is here, and it's great to see you, Anil, on doing a comprehensive, in-depth analysis of what software meant to the United States economy. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the findings there, and then we can talk about what that means for the economy as a whole. But the top line, or the bottom line answer is, if you look at software's overall economic impact on the United States, we are talking about $1 trillion in terms of GDP. That is about 465 in direct, and the rest in indirect and induced. But the software industry has a $1 trillion impact on the US economy. And that is a significant number by any measure. If you look at jobs, software is responsible for 10 million jobs in the United States. That's 250 direct, but if you add in the indirect as well, that is 10 million jobs across the United States. If you look at software research and development, we are 17% of the R&D investment in the United States as a whole. That's $52 billion in software R&D every year. So tremendous economic impact. I think one thing that is, you asked what was surprising to me, and I think I wouldn't say that those numbers were surprising, because going into this, I had a sense, probably because of what I do, that software had a big impact on the US economy. I was struck by the size of the numbers, but what I found surprising, what I think is actually really interesting about the report, is if you drill down beyond the national level and you look at the state level data, the scope of the impact that software is having across the United States. So we talk a lot about the fact that software is having an impact across economic sectors, and that's absolutely true. The financial sector, the healthcare sector, the insurance sector, the agriculture sector, the auto sector, almost every sector in the United States is enormously impacted by software. But what was interesting to me is that if you look at almost every state in the United States is impacted by software. And I would have expected that if you look at, say, a state like California, it's going to be a significant chunk, say, of their R&D investment. What was really interesting to me is that if you use 20% of a state's R&D budget as a cutoff, and 20% is a sizable percentage, then you are talking about states like North Carolina, Utah, Nebraska, Arkansas, Georgia. It is the widespread nature of R&D investment of software across the United States was one of the things I thought was most interesting.
And so what you're getting at there is it's not just California that's benefiting from software and software development at this point.
I mean, you know,
Nebraska,
there's obviously a lot happening in California. There's a lot happening in the states that you would expect, but it is one thing that was, while the numbers are not obviously consistent from state to state, one thing that was consistent was how widespread the impact was across the states of the United States.
And talk to me a little bit more about this research and development piece. Was really, what does that mean in this context? So what does that mean in terms of, I suppose, maybe jobs in that state, but also in the broader context of like why we, even as a country, need R&D and what this looks like when we talk about it, with coding and the creation of software and the testing of it and the iteration.
I'd be happy to, and I think that's actually going to be, I know one of the things we want to talk about today is the fact that we are an industry that has more jobs than we can fill. And I think part of that comes from the enormous investment in research and development. But if you look at research and development across software, it encompasses so many different areas that aren't always actually equated with software. The industry is putting a lot of research and development into artificial intelligence, which is being used in all sorts of interesting ways. There are numerous examples in the healthcare industry with our members working to try to improve rates and speed of diagnosis to cure patients using artificial intelligence. There is a lot happening in the virtual reality space. And while some of that can seem very far out, there are actually things that are happening today. So Microsoft is using HoloLens, working with NASA, so you can have a virtual reality interactive guided tour of NASA. And that's a fun thing to work on, but they're also working with the scientists at NASA to use virtual reality so the scientists can do more in-depth testing of the physics and the natural makeup of what's happening in Mars. There's a lot happening in blockchain. There are those that believe that it's going to have not just the potential, but will, in fact, change not just our financial system, but how we record assets and keep track of transactions across a whole variety of sectors. There are fantastic things happening in additive manufacturing, what's often referred to as 3D printing. And there are almost too many examples to name there, but certainly in terms of healthcare, again, in terms of prosthetics that are being printed here, but also in the developing world. Really incredible things happening. So when I talk about software research and development, part of that is going into what I suppose people might call more traditional software products, but the industry is much, much broader to that, and that's why you're seeing these enormous numbers in terms of research and development across the United States.
Yeah, this is not about just what maybe even 10, 15 years ago was picking up some sort of box off of, I don't know, Radio Shack's shelf, right, back then. This is not boxed software. Right. This is much broader, everything cloud computing, artificial intelligence that you're talking about here. So last quick question for you. This report was telling us a snapshot in time. It was, so this time, this is the impact on our economy. This is how we can quantify that. But what do we know about the impact over time?
So that's a great question. And just to sort of let you all in on a little bit of what happened inside the organization, we actually first did this as a snapshot in time. And then we were looking at it, and we thought it'd be really interesting to know what happened over time. Yeah. Was there a spike all of a sudden? Is the industry actually in a decline? Is this a plateau? Is this kind of where the industry has been for the last 10 years? So we decided to go back, and so you all are getting all the data at the same time. For us, it was actually a two-step process. So we went back and we did a second round of research on where things were in 2004. And what we found is that there has been a substantial increase over the last decade. Not to say that software wasn't a big contributor to the economy in 2004, but if you look, say, at the GDP number, the $1 trillion number, we're at about 650 10 years ago. So there has been a 50% increase, essentially, to $1 trillion today. If you look at jobs, we're at 10 million jobs. There were 750,000 of those were added over the last 10 years. That is a lot of jobs to be created by one industry over a 10-year time period. So it was, I'm glad we did it because I think it's been interesting, and I think it has interesting implications to see that fairly substantial increase over the last decade.
It's not lost on me that 2004 there was no iPad. There were no, the App Store, right?
Right.
Didn't exist.
So you were talking a little bit about the transformation of the industry, and the last decade is where much of that has happened and is obviously continuing to happen. But I have the fun job of representing an industry that is literally transforming itself every day, and much of that has been happening in the last few years, and it's going to continue into the future.
Yeah. So let me turn to you, Mark, having looked at some of these numbers in the report. What do you think this means for the U.S. economy?
So I think this is hugely important, and if I could follow up on Victoria's comments just a little bit. First, thanks for having me here. What I'd like to do is talk a little bit about what else we could talk about in terms of the industry, in terms of its importance today and its importance in the past, but also more importantly, especially for all the policy wonks here, which I imagine there's quite a few, is how important this is going forward. So let's start with that first bucket, though, of kind of in the past and the present. So when we look at this industry, it's been hugely important for the growth of the US economy, not just in terms of number of jobs, but it's really important because every industry, every entity, every government entity uses software and computer hardware and communications technology to become more efficient. So when you couple all those together, because starting in the 1990s, we really did have this revolutionary change. If you look at all of those together, that triumvirate of software, computers, and communications technology was the single biggest driver of economic growth in the United States from the 90s through the 2000s, okay? And that's just hugely important. Another aspect of this industry which is hugely important is that the United States, we're really good at this. And how do we know that? We export over $40 billion of computer software according to the national accounts. And I think that number is probably understated for a couple of reasons. That's about 7 times more than we import. So this is an industry where we just have a killer trade advantage relative to the rest of the world. So that's just incredibly important. And then Victoria was talking about just how many jobs, and Victoria and I used to work together on a number of projects. And sometimes when you say millions and things like that, it kind of glosses over people. But as Victoria mentioned, software is something that affects all jobs. And if you look at people in the industry, these are really high-paying jobs, which isn't surprising. But the great thing about this report is it actually quantifies it. So if the average wage is $108,000, that's a lot of money. If you think about the median household income in the United States is only about $50,000. So these are really high-paying, high-quality jobs. When I was looking at the BSA members, a lot of those companies are also considered to be really great places to work, right? I mean, the SAS Institute has been up there for just years and years and years. Okay, so that's the present and the past. Just some other things to add on to the narrative that's been going forward. So when we're looking forward, my predecessors were talking about R&D. And if we think about the economy going forward, there's a couple trends that are happening. One trend is happening is that we are getting just more and more data. The Internet of Things, various sensors, businesses are realizing that they have to use this information. In the government space, we want empirical-based policy decisions, okay? We want evidence-based policy. Same thing in business. And people have great desires to crunch their own numbers as well. How can we do that? So we have this huge explosion of data, the phrase big data, extreme data, whatever phrase you want to use. We need the software to take these huge amounts, and not only they're huge, but they're just growing exponentially. And for those of you who've actually crunched data before, the bigger the data set, the harder it is. You need better and better tools to answer all these questions. And so I think a great tagline when I was thinking about this is that the software industry is going to make our businesses more competitive. It's going to make them more efficient because they're going to be making smarter decisions. It's going to make our government much more effective as well, because all the government agencies, the state and local level and the federal level, will be able to make smarter policy decisions because they're going to be able to process this data. You can only process data if you have the right software tools to do it. And it'll also just make our citizens more informed. It will make them happier because they're able to process this information. And so as an economist, when I'm looking at this, we have a chronic, I'm going to say a chronic shortage, maybe other speakers will speak to this as well, of people who can develop these tools. And this is an industry, as I mentioned before when I was talking about the trade numbers, this is an industry where the United States has a real comparative advantage relative to most other countries in the world. And so therefore, from a policy perspective, are we doing everything we can to really leverage this advantage that we have? So as an economist, that's just kind of my take.
And that's a question we can kind of bring back or come back to as well. So Ryan, I mean, some of these labor questions I was going to ask you are already coming up in our conversation here. But given your perch right now in understanding a variety of different economic forces at work, what do you see as well, first of all, kind of the report, does it speak to you in any way when it comes to like what kind of workforce we need? And how do you see that compared to, say, the labor workforce of 25 years ago? What are some of the differences we need to recognize here?
Yeah, so I think the interesting thing the report points out is just both the large and growing number of jobs that are software and technology jobs, and also the pervasiveness of that across the United States and across industries. The most recent stat I saw was 2/3 of tech jobs are actually outside of the tech sector. And I think that leads us to think, one, a big opportunity in terms of lots of unpaid, well-filling jobs people could fill. At the same time, I think it can also scare people thinking, in the future, does this mean the robots are going to be taking all of our jobs? So if we look back, for example, to other kind of transformations where we saw big shifts in job changes, like the shift from the agricultural economy. I mean, at that point, 41% of jobs were involved in food production. Today, it's about 2%. And that didn't mean that jobs went away, but it meant that the skills required for those jobs really changed. At that point, one of the things that allowed us to both make that shift less painful and take the best opportunity of it was our education and training programs were racing kind of even faster than those shifts were happening. So that was the point where you saw massive investments in K through 12 education, really the start of investments in higher education, which allowed folks to move from manual rote labor to really unlocking more human potential. So I think the question becomes, what is the new paradigm that we need to see given the shifts in technology change that the report points out? I think there are a couple of things. One, we know that these technology changes are going to lead to job shifting not every decade or century, but every year and months, which means that our education and training programs need to be able to adapt as fast as those jobs needs are changing. I went to Delaware recently to talk to their employers and community colleges about why the tech employers weren't hiring anyone from the community college. And it turned out they were teaching a coding language that was 3 years behind what employers were actually using. And so we know it's just not happening fast enough. Two things that I think could make a difference, both that are really kind of leveraging technology to solve this problem. One is using the rich amounts of data that we have right now to create kind of faster feedback cycles between what employers are looking for and what training programs are producing. So one good example of something happening there is Coursera has started to get real-time feedback from employers about what they need. And then they basically put out an RFP to universities and say, hey, who can teach these skills to, that folks need back to an employer, and then create online courses that can reach many people. Another good example is LinkedIn is now piloting experiments in Phoenix and Colorado, where they actually have employers say on their platform, I hired from this education program, did it give me the results that I was looking for or not? That I think can help both that training program upgrade, but also help folks know, is that a place I should be going if I want to get a job? The other thing that I think can help is kind of aligning the incentives of our education programs more around the outcomes they're producing in terms of learning and employment. So one thing we've been doing in the administration is looking at, we spend billions of dollars on federal student aid and helping low-income students get through higher ed. We just launched last year an experiment called EQUIP. I'm forgetting what that acronym stands for right now. But basically what that does is it says that new types of non-traditional education providers like coding boot camps, online courses that traditionally couldn't get access to that funding can access federal student aid, but they have to show us that they're producing really good outcomes for their students and making that funding contingent on those outcomes, which is kind of dramatically different from the way that we do things today. So that's one piece, is education adapting faster. I think the other thing is, in this world where folks are going to be needing to change jobs more and more often, that means that you need to be getting credit in the hiring process for skills not just learned when you got a degree, but learned on the job, learned from a short online course that you take, and really over the course of your lifetime. And the hard part about that right now is employers don't really allow for that sort of thing in a lot of their hiring screens. So one of the things we found, for example, when we were doing work on long-term unemployment was, folks would apply with exactly the same education and experience. If one had been unemployed for a certain amount of time, they were 50% less likely to get an interview. And a lot of that goes back to, HR focusing more on inputs rather than what happened to someone after they got employed with your company. Were they retained? Were they highly productive and successful? And so I think interventions that allow folks to really demonstrate what they can do when they're getting hired can make a big difference as well.
And I'll have to take a moment then to put in a plug for Opportunity at Work, which is one of the organizations and programs here at New America. And I know Byron is here as well, and maybe later can give a little bit more information about the Tech Hire program that Opportunity at Work is doing. But it is, again, it's kind of focused on what you're saying there at the end of your remarks, that part of this is about rewiring the employer's way of thinking about who should be hired for the jobs, rewiring the way that they're making decisions about who's hired, so that we're getting talent into these jobs instead of holding back. Let me go to you, Cameron. At code.org, and there's just a host of things we could ask you related to what skills the workforce is going to need, what it really takes to drive this new approach. But I wanted to first just get a sense from you about, as you're reading this report and what implications come to mind, how are you seeing the software industry? And maybe, let me even back up further. First, there are many people here who probably don't know enough about code.org and need to understand it. So start with that, and then tell us about what the implications are in this report.
Sure. So thanks for having me on the panel. I really appreciate the chance to come talk about these issues. Code.org is a nonprofit. We're funded to provide every student that wants an opportunity to learn computer science at the K-12 level a chance to do so. That's our mission. We work on a lot of different initiatives in the K-12 space. Most of our time is spent engaging directly with school districts, teachers, and students around the country to transform our education system so that students have this opportunity to learn computer science. We also run what's now a global campaign called the Hour of Code, which hundreds of millions of students participated in, heads of states, members of Congress, governors, that really gets kids excited about computer science, just to give them a little bit of taste of what's going on. So that's a little bit of what code.org is all about and what our mission is. It's really about the formal K-12 education space. And to me, looking at the report, completely reinforces the work that we've been doing at the K-12 level. So I'm going to bring it into that context, which is, where does this foundation come from? Like, the software industry has a lot of roots in higher ed. It also has roots back in the K-12 space that we can start to talk about and like think about what the implications are moving forward. So to me, this just, when I read through the report and sort of the overall job impacts and economic impacts, these are things that we know and that we've seen and data that we've collected through code.org. And I think this just reinforces the argument that we've made, particularly on the Hill with about 100 other companies and the Computer Science Education Coalition, that we need targeted funding, targeted federal funding for K-12 computer science education. That's been our goal for this year as part of our work and as part of the Computer Science for All initiative, so we can close the access gap to computer science. But let me give you a little bit of context around that policy framework. So imagine a world where computing jobs are the #1 source of all new wages in the US, that computer science majors are the #1 hired major out when graduating from college, meaning they have a higher employment than any other field. That when kids take computer science courses, it's the most loved subject at the K-12 level, besides performing arts and art and design. That job demand in computing-related occupations is 4 times higher than any other occupation in the US. And that 90% of parents, when they poll it, want computer science in our schools. Imagine that world, and now imagine that only 1/4 of our students have access to computer science education in our K-12 schools. Imagine that AP computer science today that's taught at the high school levels is about an order of magnitude 10 times less widely taught than AP calculus in our schools. And of those students that take AP computer science, only 20% are girls. And there are some states in this nation where not one Black or one Hispanic student is taking AP computer science at the high school. Now, I want you to imagine that world, and it's not hard to imagine. Obviously, this is a rhetorical sort of setup here, because this is the world we live in, right? And if you start to look at this report and that other data and just what's going on in the K-12 space, you quickly react like, of course it makes sense for not only economic reasons, but national security reasons, right? We have this big issue with cybersecurity and national competitiveness issues where we need US cleared citizens to be able to take jobs at NSA and cyber defense in the Defense Department to create the next generation of software that's secured software. So these are sort of all the needs that are in this space, and you sort of quickly reach the conclusion that of course we would want to have targeted federal funding to really address these issues and expand and close the access gap we find in K-12 CS education, so we can continue to grow this industry. I want to just go back to the theme that you've heard from the first 3 panelists here is about jobs. And I want to talk a little bit about the #1 source of all new wages in the US. This is data that we've pulled in from the US Conference Board, which provides data to the Fed on sort of job openings in the US. So at any given point in the US, I've been tracking this for about 3 years, there's over 500,000 jobs open today. There's about 540,000 jobs open nationally today, and they're spread across every state. And when you look at the state data, you basically find in every state, computing jobs and healthcare workers are the 2 most in-demand jobs, okay? Now, when you take the number of open jobs and you across every category, these are occupations, and you multiply it by what Mark said, the median wage here, you reach a quick conclusion that computer science and computing-related jobs are the #1 source of all new wages in the US. This is more than healthcare, more than management occupations, more than finance, more than service industry, culinary, any of those jobs. There's the teachers, those are great jobs. But when you look at the economic impact that computing is having in this country, it's just absolutely crystal clear that we have a real major issue about the pipeline where it's driving so much of our modern economy. And we're not providing this background, this foundational knowledge at the K-12 level. And that's a critical, and particularly in an equitable basis. And that's just an issue we need to fix. And that's one of the things that, my reaction to this report and sort of how I think it fits in with this overall narrative that our country, and actually globally, we're seeing multiple countries now step up and say, we're going to make computer science something that every kid should get exposed to because it's obvious, the writing's on the wall on this.
That's a great segue to Melissa and the work that the U.S. Department of Education and their STEM division is doing. Can you, Melissa, tell us a little bit about where things stand right now in terms of what the U.S. Department of Ed's been doing over the past year or more in STEM and how it connects to this conversation?
Of course, and Cameron mentioned the Computer Science for All work, which I would love to talk a little bit more about. But first, in terms of picking up on some additional themes, as I was reading through the report, I mean, it's just so clear. There's so much wealth and opportunity that's available when we are looking at software, when we are looking at things that require fundamental computer science. And it begged the question to me, as Cameron mentioned, who gets to participate? Who gets to benefit from the opportunities that are available? And so one of the big places where the Department of Education has chosen to focus in terms of STEM, which we include computer science in STEM, has been around equity and really wanting to treat computer science access as an equity issue, because it is. We know from Cameron that a quarter of schools offer it. Most of the kids who do not get to participate in computer science are kids of color, kids in low-income communities, and girls. And there's a number of reasons for that. First, it's not offered in their school. Second, we also have to look at who is either encouraged to take it either explicitly or implicitly. When we look at images around, I mean, you can all conjure up in your mind, when I say something like computer science, there's probably an image that, and who does it? A computer scientist. There's probably an image that pops into your head. And it is probably not a girl, or I should say in my case, like there is a stereotype there. And we need to be very aware, and in particular when we are supporting educators, when we're supporting states, when we're supporting all of the people that are involved in actually giving this opportunity to students, ensuring that we are actively working against the biases that we have all been exposed to through just living in society. So a couple of things that we are working on that I think this report really reinforces is, first of all, is computer science for all. And so this report reinforces the fact that computer science is a fundamental piece and should be a fundamental piece of every child's education in this country. So on January 30th, the president talked about computer science for all in his weekly address, and talked about that this should be just something that all kids get, just like they would get reading and writing and math. And I think this report really emphasizes that this is something that should be available and ubiquitous for all kids, given we're interacting with technology. And I think there's oftentimes a misconception that just because many kids have phones, many kids use the stuff, that we actually know how it works. There's a pretty big difference, and computer science is really important because we want our kids to be creating that technology, not just utilizing it. And so that has been one big push. And so we put out 2 budget proposals in the president's FY17 budget to support computer science education for all children. One that would go directly to states to be able to provide the much needed support and resources to train teachers, to put together comprehensive plans, and another that would be an opportunity for districts to do the same. Ultimately, the importance of, or when you look at those proposals, you need to have a course that's offered at the high school level for computer science, but you also need to think about the fact that it starts early. We know as early as preschool, and in some cases even earlier. And so how are we building those course progressions starting as early as preschool all the way through 8th grade, so that by the time that kids get to high school, they know what computer science is, that they might want to take it, it might be something that they want to explore. So that has been a big focus of our work in the STEM office. In addition, as I mentioned, the sort of continued focus on computer science as an equity issue. This can be an incredible opportunity to be able to close very persistent equity gaps that we see in this country because of the high wages that are available. You think about the opportunity that going into computer science or a computing-related field provides for a student who is coming from a low-income background in terms of their employment and the amount of money that they can make over the course of their life. That is huge, but we have to treat it as an equity issue, which means really focusing on the persistent equity gaps, really ensuring that the resources are going to schools that otherwise would not have access to this opportunity, that we are sort of very consistently and deliberately focusing on that. And so there's been a number of things that we have tried to do to be able to ensure that folks know about the opportunity to use federal funds to be able to support closing those equity gaps, including putting out a Dear Colleague letter in April, talking about the opportunity to use Title I, Title II funds to be able to support STEM and computer science education. And then, as was mentioned, the EQIP programs and a number of other things. But ultimately, I think really what we've tried to do is focus on the equity issues in computer science and figure out ways to utilize federal funds to be able to support closing those equity gaps.
So you're actually kind of outlining in some ways some of the threats to what right now is a fairly strong position that the United States does have in terms of its production of software, its ability to export at such a high rate. There are obviously jobs still to be filled, but there are also a lot of jobs that are being filled. And yet we have a new population of students coming up through our pre-K-12 schools that are coming from very underserved communities and may not have this kind of access. And one, just from my where I sit on the education side, I see some real gaps in terms of the faculty in our schools being able to have the resources and the training themselves to know what to teach. I mean, this story of community colleges teaching a coding language that's like 3 years behind doesn't surprise me at some level, right? Because where are these professors, often adjunct faculty themselves, barely kind of keeping up? So that may be one. Let me turn that into a question, and then we'll go to kind of maybe some policy solutions. But what do you all see as some threats on the horizon? What might really jeopardize our position in terms of the economic powerhouse that is software?
So I'll say two. And I won't go on at length, but we're in DC, we're in a policy town, so there are policy wonks in the audience. And so I think one thing that we are very mindful of is governments putting policies in place that will allow software to thrive or will inhibit the growth of software. And just to pick one that I think is very much sort of front of mind at the moment, it's data and how data moves across borders. So governments putting policies in place that will promote software, promote cloud computing, promote data moving across borders, as opposed to putting policies in place that will fragment data, cause data localization, try to keep data within their borders. That dichotomy, I think, is really important. And we, certainly from where I sit, we see governments around the world considering policies or moving towards policies that would cut off the movement of data. Right now, in fact, this very week, there are negotiations going on between the United States and Europe on that very issue, on how data can move back and forth between the United States and Europe. And I think if we don't collectively get that right, that is a big threat for software and therefore for the US economy and the global economy as a whole. The second challenge I would mention is the one that we've already talked about at some length, so I'm happy to talk about it more and kind of what we should be doing in terms of the industry and in terms of government, but the bottom line is trying to get more coders into that pipeline, and I very much say that I think some substantial percentage of our new young coders should be girl coders. I think that will make our software more innovative, more creative. I think it'll make our software more secure if we have more young girls becoming coders as well. And we as an organization are very proud to support Girls Who Code here in Washington, D.C. But I think having the industry and the government doing more to encourage young people to go into computer science and education coding is extremely important to try to, so that we can continue to fulfill sort of what we have today.
Are there other threats that have come up for any of you?
I think
concerns?
The main concern is sort of what I hit on before. I mean, I think if we're the country that invented the internet, we don't actually teach how it works in the schools, like at any foundational level. We teach how a cell works. We teach how electricity works. These are all sort of foundational aspects. And there's the question is, are we going to continue to be the country that innovates, that is on the cutting edge? Now, there's obviously a lot of policies that are related to that. I'm talking about the talent side of things. And we'll just sort of you unpack sort of one slice of this, which is females, right? So we know that girls that take AP computer science are 10 times more likely to major in computer science when they have exposure at the high school level and moving into college. So there's a serious threat that all of those, the females that are in the current generation will miss out on what's an incredibly fast-growing dynamic industry. That's a threat sort of on the equity issues side of things. And then just globally competitive. We know there's multiple countries, just in the past couple of years, the United Kingdom is making computer science a compulsory part of their curriculum. Japan, Australia, Germany's looking at legislation around this. Now, Finland, Estonia, there's multiple countries that sort of are moving in this direction. Now, we can't do the same things because of certain policy issues related to the US around education, but as just sort of a economic imperative and sort of our global competitiveness, we have to take a look and say, are we preparing a future workforce, the talent side of things, so we can continue to have what Mark talked about, which basically software gives you two things. One, a job, or increased productivity. And so you can utilize software in an existing job to make yourself more productive. And that's what provides huge number of economic gains, and particularly at low inflation. It's a really key part of economic growth. And then secondly, it just creates these jobs. And we need more students participating in that.
What about too, and maybe this will be the last question, and then we'll open it up to the audience here, but I'm also thinking a little bit about what you all think about the idea of teaching coding in context or in cross-disciplinary ways. And I'll just quickly tell you why kind of personally this is coming to me, because I, in high school, learned BASIC, back in, this is 1989, really dating myself here. But having taken a course on this very kind of basic computer programming, it enabled me to learn HTML quite quickly and understand that, which led to, but it was all embedded in an American Studies program at a college, at the University of Virginia where I was at the time. And so there was an understanding of how that could connect to something that was related to history that I loved, or to literature, or to science. And today, just even seeing what my own kids who are in middle school now are seeing when it comes to coding, sometimes it's sort of not as connected to science or to that really cool English literature course that they took. Yeah. How do we, is that an issue, and how do we kind of bring that to bear in this conversation?
So, Melissa this is a major issue. This is, we build curriculum. This is what we do, for K. So if you want to figure out, what do I teach at schools, one of the things we do is we build a pathway for K-12 teachers to actually be able to teach computer science. And I'm going to use the word computer science here as a broad field of study. And it's something Mark mentioned in his comments about data, right? So one of the major challenges we face is just getting our hands around all the data coming in from sensor networks. It's not only that you be able to sort of build software to process this, but actually knowing how to utilize the data. It turns out the data that's floating around is really, really noisy, right? So when you do a chemistry experiment and you're measuring temperature, that's clean data. It's like, oh, this, I got this reading at this level, this reading. You're talking about just noisy data that's floating around the internet or coming in from sensor networks. And being able to manipulate that is critical from sort of a broad perspective. And that's how that connects, the data analysis piece connects to almost every field that's out there. So my point is, when you start to think about it in the broad context, you end up with something like, which is the new AP computer science course that's coming out. It's starting this year. It's called AP Computer Science Principles. And it's a much broader course that teaches kids about fundamentally, how does the internet work? How do we deal with packet switching? What does compression mean for videos and art that we distribute on the net? How do I build a mobile application device that can transform my environment? Like, how do I build a bus transit tracking system just in my local community by pulling in data and sensor networks? These are all things that you can teach as a foundational part of computer science that connects to every single part of all these other fields. And that's very much an intentional design of the new AP computer science course, is to touch broadly and to be more equitable in its reach than just simply a coding course and I'm going to learn the next best language. Because I think it's obviously important to understand sort of what are the new hot languages. If you have this strong foundation, it helps you pick up languages later on, and it becomes sort of less important to understand. Like, I understand Ruby on Rails really, really well. That you can learn that from certain things, but having this foundation is absolutely critical.
I think one other thing maybe to build on that with a specific example, one of the things we've been working on is called the Opportunity Project, and basically we've worked with federal agencies to unlock data on things like transportation systems and housing and food availability. And in that case, we've been partnering with some coding schools who are working with millennials who are really interested in how do I apply my coding and CS skills to solving real social problems. And in that case, they have capstones where, at the end of their time, they're building a website or an app that solves a problem. So they're using Opportunity Project data to solve real issues in their communities. So for example, one of the apps identified where food deserts are in communities that could be a feedback to policymakers about where they need to make changes. Or they created an app for summer jobs where kids can figure out, based on my job, where is the nearest kind of public transit that I can get for low cost. So I think that's the other thing is how do we enable more folks to use their CS skills and see it as ways to solve problems that they uniquely care about.
And we'll see faster changes in the gender gap in particular if we teach all STEM subjects, computer science included, in that way. The research consistently shows that girls do better when you teach in problem-based ways, because we have a relevance problem. If things feel sort of abstract and like, when am I ever going to use this? And how many kids ask that all the time in their classes? And we make up answers and we figure them out, but there's actual real ways you are going to use all of this computer science work, and showing that actually by having kids solve real problems is huge. And I think we'll see the gender gap close much faster if we teach that way.
Great, okay, well I will open it up now to some questions. There's a lot of stuff we can talk about here. We'll take one here. And please give us your name and your institution, and then just go straight to the question.
Hi, Miguel Palabrica, Hudson Institute. So I was just wondering first, I have two questions. So first, how married is the results of this input-output model presented in this? It's a modeling question, so it's kind of boring, but how married is it to private valuations of companies? There's obviously concerns about those valuations with VCs kind of moving back in recent years. So these numbers look amazing. So I was just wondering if there are any kind of more nuances within the model that might cause maybe inflated or deflated numbers. And then second question, a lot of economic development literatures points to culture as being important to the success of certain companies and industries within certain regions. So going on the equity issue, so I'm a Hispanic computer programmer, so this is kind of in my territory. But that's not the case for software. Let's just put that out there, right? So that cultural force that drives the economic performance of a region isn't necessary. But the concept for business still has, we need these certain male-dominated or white cultures in order to have the traditional software environment. So how would you go about, I guess, just to use the buzzword, disrupting or trying to change the perceptions of these corporate cultures to make it more inviting to female programmers or minority programmers or that kind of thing?
So the answer to your first question is no. And in fact, we went to some lengths to use conservative definitions and assumptions so that we would have a really credible set of data.
No meaning, no, you didn't look at the valuations of companies?
So your question was kind of, the way I would paraphrase is how much sway is there in the numbers because of the modeling, and could the numbers have turned out a very different way if they had been modeled in different ways? Is that essentially what you're asking? And I think the answer to that is no. And that's because we were very careful, I would even say conservative, about how we went about our assumptions and our methodology. And economists could feel free to weigh in there, but that's just from the person who kind of oversaw the organization and the direction of the report. I think the question that you asked about culture is very interesting, so I will answer it briefly, but then leave it to others who I think may have more interesting thoughts on that. I do think there is, and I'm going to focus on the part of your question where you talked about getting more females into tech. I do think the sort of perception issue and the non-virtuous cycle that has been created at the moment, where you have sort of a perception of what a computer scientist or a coder is, kind of guy in the basement with a hoodie is a popular perception that is out there. That is, all of us as human beings want to be with people like us, so that's not necessarily an appealing image to everyone, and it leads to a cycle. So therefore, fewer women or girls go into coding and computer scientists, so therefore there are less role models, so therefore less go into it. And I think to me, one of the reasons or some of the data that supports that we're in that cycle is the fact that we are actually going backwards in terms of women going into coding and computer sciences, which is really staggering. So if you look at the 1980s, 39% of computer science graduates were women. Today, that number is 17%. We are significantly regressing in terms of women going into computer science. That is a cycle that we have to turn around, but I think a big part of that plays into perceptions. And so, if the government and the industry can make a big push to try to break that perception and get more women and girls going into coding, my hope and my expectation is we can turn that cycle around and create a more virtuous cycle.
I'll add just a couple of things on the culture question. I think you're absolutely right. I think that starts early, and I think we pick it up, from lots of different ways. I think a lot can be done actually when it comes to data. So, in terms of working with educators, you ask the question: do the demographics of your computer science course map to the demographics of the school? If the answer is no, you should dig into that and ask why, and figure out why. Same thing in terms of looking at industry and various job settings. Does it match the demographics of the college population? Does it match the demographics? Do your specific engineering and computer science divisions match the demographics of the overall company? Or are you seeing many more women in like your HR functions? And why? And what sort of policies are then in place? And then you should ask people in terms of like what their experiences are and try to work on that. I think a number of companies are really trying to figure out what it means to have a more inclusive culture and workplace through things like training for their employees, training for hiring managers, experimenting with different hiring practices, looking more at competency-based hiring as opposed to, did you graduate from these 6 schools with these grade point averages? Really trying to have more holistic processes, I think will help and go a very long way. I think a lot can be done through examining of data and asking those questions.
And I think one other thing is more female entrepreneurs and females kind of in leadership positions. I think one interesting thing is more females, at least in my experience, do have this kind of imposter syndrome. So if you look, for example, females' likelihood to apply for a job if they don't meet 100% of the characteristics, they're very unlikely. If men meet 60% of the characteristics, they'll probably apply for the job. So I was on a panel like this recently, and someone told the story of Sergey and Larry when they started Google. And it was interesting because there were so many things they really screwed up along the way, and so many times when they needed a mentor or a professor, or John Doerr, I think, was like, I'll give you $5 million and introduce you to these 10 people who can help you. And I had never heard that story. And I think so often we think of entrepreneurs as these folks who have all these really special attributes and they were just able to make it, but we don't tell the stories of how hard it was, of failure, of needing to ask for help. And if you look at research like Carol Dweck shows, kids in school, when they can point to someone like Lincoln or Obama or a mentor who failed, that gives them much more confidence to go and try things in the future. So I think getting out those stories of entrepreneurs could be particularly impactful for women.
So I'll just add, look, culture is really difficult to solve. It always, if you study this, it flows from the top, right? And meaning in any organization, the leadership team typically sets the culture of the organization. I have no expertise in this, but I'd point you to, there's a great organization called the National Center for Women in Information Technology. They have a tremendous amount of resources about how corporations can, research-based resources on how they can transform their culture. I'm actually optimistic for sort of the long-term perspective on this, because I'm seeing firsthand the growth of computer science in our schools. And particularly at the K-5 level, 3 years ago, Code.org started, we had 0 students. Right now, we have about 6 million students in our K-5 platform. And the gender balance is about 50-50. It's a little bit less girls. And the reason why it's 50-50 versus like AP computer science, which is 80-20, males to females, is because it's being taught in the classroom where we have the gender balance already. It's just a part of the classroom. It's an embedded part. And I'm not saying that'll transform the culture quickly, but we know just exposing girls earlier on to computer science and sort of the broad view of computer science is going to help address these issues from the long-range perspective. And they'll be more likely to major in it. They'll be more likely to major in other things and understand, how do I pull things I learned out of computer science into my art program so that I can create this new awesome digital art software? Things like that are going to happen over time.
And it strikes me, certainly this it's a conversation about gender, but certainly across communities of color, there are many of the same pieces that apply, and some of the work that we've done on the education side have looked at media in the way it portrays, for younger audiences, the way it portrays computer programmers or people who work in STEM, and that is changing. There's a concerted effort to ensure that people of color are part of the characters of various stories that children are seeing on TV or in games. We'll see, right, if that has an impact. Let's go to the next question here. I think there's one in the front, and then we'll have time for one more after that.
Thank you very much. I'm a member for UNESCO Task Force for the last UNESCO Task Force for the last 16 years. I did not read your reports. I just browsed them. At the first look, I did not notice very much international concern, except crowdsourcing. My experience between Europe and US and also Japan and US is that if United States could could engage other countries, specifically Europe, in a differentiated way, probably between Eastern Europe, European Union, European Commission, and Nordic countries, to engage in advance where you stand, what is the innovation all about, and probably use international organization, it would probably address or mitigate some of your problems, including jobs and so on. My impression today is that even in you know about TTIP and how much transatlantic investment partnership agreement, which is you compare with TPP, Trans-Pacific.
You can just get straight to
So
the
my question is,
you.
how would you would BSA or other international American organizations, not just Department of State, not just Department of Commerce, would it be possible to have an initiative, heavy initiative? What is software? What are the implications on jobs, social implications, and so on, and how to respond policy-wise at European Union level, Africa, whatever. But it's a big change, and the implications are far-reaching, whether social, economic, culture, and so on.
Yes. Is there promise for any kind of international conversation on this front?
So, you know, both in the job that I have now and from my former roles as a trade negotiator and at the White House, I'm all for international conversation. I think there are big changes that are coming. I think our government is grappling with these changes. Governments around the world are grappling with the changes. So I will answer your question very briefly by saying I'm in complete agreement that we need to have more and robust discussions among the nations of the world about how we're going to collectively address both the opportunities and the challenges that are coming up, both in trade agreements, but in other forms as well.
Cross-border issue
Yes.
that you raised,
Yeah.
for example.
Exactly.
And on the education side, I was actually yesterday at the launch of the Teach Her initiative. And so UNESCO is leading with the Institute for International Education on training a master's STEAM cohort, so including arts and design, and computer science was included in all of that to be able to support middle school girls. And so they're going to be training a whole bunch of educators in a number of countries with 2 trainings, one in Ethiopia and one in Costa Rica coming up. So starting to open the dialogue too around the teacher training and ways that we can sort of share resources and support and all the various pieces there too.
That's right.
Yeah.
Okay. Last question, if I can. We'll go to the back there.
Hi, Brendan DeSetti with the Software and Information Industry Association. I just wanted to get some of your thoughts on how we can use existing policies in the education space today to address the pipeline of students coming into these careers, but also retraining adult workers whose skills have become outdated. It was really great to see the president's budget and the department supporting some new programs that support coding, but we have existing programs right now that are underfunded or they're just not working quite right. So what is the department doing? What could the Congress do to, for instance, reauthorize the Carl D. Perkins Career and Technical Education Act, or to actually support the new Title IV grants under ESSA, which support well-rounded student programs and technology? If you could speak to some existing policies and what we could do.
Yeah, of course. So I'll share a little bit, and then I'm sure others have things to add. So great point on Title IV. So you'll see under the new law, every student...
Title IV, for those who may not follow, so the latest education law, Every Student Succeeds Act, has a Title Title IV.
Title IV, and under that, a piece of it is a well-rounded education. You'll see STEM and computer science mentioned very explicitly throughout the law, mostly under Title IV, but also under Title II and a couple of other places. One of the reasons that we put out the Dear Colleague letter, which covers the Every Student Succeeds Act does not go into full effect until the school year 17-18. So we put out the Dear Colleague letter to talk about the last year of federal funds that will go out under NCLB. And in that, we were very explicit about ways that you can use existing title dollars, so big chunks of formula dollars that are going to states. Title I around equity, Title II around teacher training and support, to be able to support things like teacher training, teacher recruitment, all for STEM and computer science. So I think that is a great resource to be able to look at. Obviously, the more support that we can have for Title IV will be hugely helpful as states are thinking about how to make this all happen. There are a number of states that are really wanting to do more in computer science, and we just know it costs money to train teachers and to build curriculum or to work with various partners, and it just takes a lot to do that. So Title IV will be very helpful. In addition, I would say looking at some of the discretionary grant programs, there are opportunities. For example, the Investing in Innovation grant program, which application is open right now for, has an existing STEM priority, of which computer science would be eligible for that too. So continuing to encourage folks to look at those opportunities and hopefully to continue to have funds to be able to support that, given that a number of people are utilizing those discretionary grant programs to do STEM activities, including computer science. So I think those are the big ones that I would cover. I don't know if you add.
I can touch a little bit on the adult retraining. I mean, I think you're exactly right that we have a lot of tools and frankly funding in our toolbox right now that we can use. One thing particularly on workforce training is a lot of the decisions about where federal funding go are made at the local level. One thing that we've been doing through the Tech Hire program that you mentioned earlier is really the president issued a call to action for communities to work with employers to stand up more fast-track training programs that prepare more people for jobs in technology, and then have employers kind of give those real-time feedback loops to training about how they're doing, and at the same time kind of offer funding to that. So one good example of a step that's been taken is in New York City, they have a boot camp called Flatiron that typically serves Brown English majors with four-year degrees that are transitioning in technology. They've worked with their public workforce system to create a program specifically for low-income, kind of out-of-school, out-of-work young people, bring them in, provide them a set of kind of more robust mentorships and supports than you would otherwise get, and give them coding skills, and then pair them up with an internship with a company like Foursquare or Kickstarter at the end of that program, so that they can move into tech jobs. And that's something that's been, for the most part, funded with federal workforce dollars, but it's a really creative way for a city to use that funding in very new ways. So one thing is just sharing that story with more communities, and we're doing what we can to help them learn from each other about how to use that funding better. The other thing, one thing we're doing at the federal level is a big new workforce law was just passed about 2 years ago in 2014. The president signed into law. There we're trying to give more people data on employment outcomes of training programs so they can kind of vote with their feet rather than wasting time and money on stuff that doesn't work. So as a part of that new law, we'll be implementing a scorecard that tells people for each federally funded training program what happened to folks like me in terms of employment and earnings coming out of it. And I think that's the type of thing that, will really show, for example, training programs in technology are producing better outcomes.
And we might need software to help interpret that data that's coming out of that report.
To find the right people in the federal government who can actually build that, which is hard.
So I think that'll close us down for today. I wanted to say a big thank you to all of our panelists here for your great remarks, and to our audience for coming today. And I believe there are some drinks.